On January 13, 1956, Dr. Morris Jessup, a distinguished scientist and author of the book The Case for the UFO, received a strange and perplexing letter at his Miami home. Written on hotel notepaper and postmarked Gainesville, Texas, the letter was a long, rambling scrawl with different colored pens and pencils. Its language was arcane and in places barely literate. But its contents were truly sensational. The writer claimed that in the fall of 1943, the U.S. destroyer Eldridge, while in dock in Philadelphia, was, at the flick of a switch, rendered invisible. Moments later, the ship is supposed to have appeared 300 miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. Then, just as mysteriously, it vanished again, materializing within minutes back in Philadelphia. Was what became known as the Philadelphia experiment merely the product of someone's fevered imagination, or did it really happen? The bizarre letter was the second one Jessup had received from the same writer. The first, 3 months earlier, did not mention the Eldridge, but discussed at length the levitation of massive objects and the use of anti-gravity to transport them through time and space. Both letters were signed Carlos Miguel Allende. Initially, Jessup dismissed them as the work of a crank, but he was intrigued. His book on UFOs had been published the year before, 1955. It was considered an intelligent and reasonably credible view on how an as yet undiscovered principle of anti-gravity might be used to cause things to vanish and reappear elsewhere. Jessup began to wonder if there were more to the strange letters than met the eye. He knew that during World War II, the U.S. military had conducted all kinds of top-secret experiments. Perhaps Allende had indeed witnessed some strange occurrence. Jessup decided to send Allende a postcard, asking if he had any evidence with which to substantiate his incredible allegations. Then, busy on a new book, he thought no more about it. Nearly 5 months later, in May 1956, he received a third letter from Allende. It was just as cryptic and strangely written as the others. Although unable to produce any tangible proof, Allende repeated his claims that the Eldridge had vanished from Philadelphia and reappeared a short time later after a brief sighting in Norfolk. Allende, who'd said he'd witnessed the whole thing from a nearby ship, claimed that the experiment had had a devastating effect on the Eldridge crew, half of them suffering mental breakdowns. Jessup couldn't tell if Allende's story was an elaborate hoax or not. He decided to forget the whole thing. And there the matter might have rested, had it not been for the intervention of the U.S. Office of Naval Research in Washington, D.C. In the summer of 1955, sometime before the strange letters were sent to Jessup, an anonymous package marked Happy Easter arrived at the ONR. It contained a copy of Jessup's book. Many of the passages were marked and margins filled with notes on teleportation, magnetic fields, telepathy, and cosmic rays. At the time, the U.S. military placed a high priority on anti-gravity research. As he tried to make sense of the annotations, Major Darrell Ritter, the ONR case officer, wondered if its anonymous sender had inadvertently stumbled across some top-secret project. He decided to hand the book over to Commander George Hoover, a prominent member of the ONR Project Orbiter Committee, which was closely involved in anti-gravity research. In the spring of 1957, Jessup was invited to Washington. As soon as he saw the book, he knew right away that the notes in it had been made by the same person who'd sent him the strange letters. The Navy's interest in the matter convinced Jessup that Allende's allegations concerning the Eldridge were perhaps not so far-fetched after all. When copies of the book were printed and circulated in senior government and military circles, he was afraid that perhaps he already knew too much about something which had been covered up for the last 14 years. Toward the end of October 1958, Jessup went to New York to see his friend Ivan Sanderson, a prominent naturalist. Over dinner, he told his host and 2 other guests he wished to speak with them privately. He then produced one of his annotated books and asked them to read it and lock it away. He was highly agitated, saying that he was certain something terrible was about to happen to him. Jessup then returned home to Florida. Within a few days, he was involved in a serious car accident. It took him weeks to recover. After that, his state of mind deteriorated rapidly. In April 1959, Jessup wrote to one of his oldest friends, Long John Nebel, a New York talk show host, saying he intended to kill himself. On April 20th, Jessup was due to have dinner with another friend, Dr. Manson Valentine. He said that after a great deal of research, he'd reached some startling and terrifying conclusions about the Philadelphia experiment, which he wanted to share with him. But he never made it. At 6:30 p.m., an attendant in a Dade County park found him in his car, barely breathing. A hose was attached to the exhaust pipe. Despite frantic efforts to revive him, Jessup died within a few minutes. It looked like suicide. But later, rumors began to circulate that although he was known to have been depressed, he had in fact been murdered by orders from on high to stop him from revealing what he knew about the Philadelphia experiment. By the summer of 1943, World War II was at its height. On July 10th, the Allies stormed the beaches of Sicily, beginning the long fight to take Europe back from the Nazis. 2 weeks later, according to the person calling himself Carl Miguel Allende, the Philadelphia experiment took place. Could the U.S. government have found a way to make a warship disappear? The U.S. Navy was already working with Albert Einstein, probably the greatest scientist of the 20th century. And it is believed they might have been testing his unified field theory. Einstein had first come up with this extraordinary concept in the 1920s. He believed that if the three basic universal forces of electromagnetism, gravity, and nuclear energy were combined, it would create a single force field. By surrounding an object with this field, the object, in theory, would then enter a time-space warp and disappear. Enormous resources were placed at Einstein's disposal as the U.S. Navy wondered if his theory could be put into practice. Hitler's days were numbered, but the Allies knew his brilliant scientists had been developing a series of devastating new weapons, including ground-to-air guided missiles and the atomic bomb. The Allies were now in a desperate high-tech race. The theory of invisibility was high on everyone's agenda. Any military commander in the field who had the ability to conceal his troops and weaponry at will could deal the enemy a knockout blow. Camouflage and invisibility were key factors to the success and safety of fighting men on all sides throughout the history of warfare. During World War I, military artists came up with the idea of painting warships and merchant ships in a disruptive pattern to make them harder to spot. This technique was known as dazzle. Bold patterns, shapes, and colors were applied to ships in such a way that when viewed through the periscope of a submarine or from an enemy ship, they could not be seen clearly against the horizon. It was almost impossible for the enemy to gauge the correct range at which to fire its guns or torpedoes. As technology became more advanced, particularly at sea, so too did the art of camouflage. When World War II broke out in September 1939, planes became more prevalent as weapons of war, and dazzle could not protect ships from the air. It soon became apparent that something much more sophisticated was required before the losses became too great to bear. With the entry of the United States into the war in December 1941, some of the best scientific brains in the world were harnessed to find out whether invisibility was a viable proposition, especially for ships. If such a thing were possible, then the war at sea could be won. Ironically, many of the scientists working for the Allies were German Jews, driven from their homeland in the 1930s by Hitler's racist policies. Einstein was one of them. Born in 1879, Einstein was a mathematical physicist who was years ahead of his time. He arrived in the U.S. in 1932, and a year later became a professor at Princeton University. In August 1939, when the start of World War II in Europe was less than a month away, Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt warning him of Germany's plans to harness nuclear energy for military purposes. In 1942, as a direct result of Einstein's letter, the U.S. government authorized its own nuclear weapons program. Called the Manhattan Project, it was the most secret scientific operation of the entire war. Meanwhile, the U.S. Defense Department employed Einstein's genius in hoping to create a less destructive means of winning the war. Whether or not this led to the Philadelphia experiment is not known. Although no official records of the experiment apparently exist, and the Office of Naval Research has always denied that such an experiment ever took place, this, according to Allende, is what is supposed to have occurred. In the summer of 1943, the USS Eldridge was fitted with tons of electronic equipment, including 2 huge generators mounted in place of the forward gun turret. At 9 a.m. on July 22nd, the generators were switched on. Within a few minutes, the ship was surrounded by a hazy green fog. Then it completely vanished. 15 minutes later, the generators were turned off and the ship slowly materialized again through the green fog. The crew was found dazed and feeling sick. As the story goes, 3 months later, on October 28th, the Navy was ready for another try, this time out in the open sea. The generators were turned on, and as before, a green fog slowly enveloped the ship, and she suddenly disappeared. Within seconds, she supposedly materialized briefly in Norfolk, Virginia, 300 miles away, before reappearing at the Philadelphia Naval Yard just moments later. This time, the effect on the crew was much more traumatic. Allegedly, some crewmen were committed to psychiatric hospitals for the rest of their lives. According to Allende, their families were told they'd been killed in action. The Navy decided not to repeat the experiment. The authorities have always dismissed Allende's account as pure fiction, but there are still those who believe that the U.S. Navy has its own reasons for wanting to keep the real truth behind the Philadelphia experiment a closely guarded secret. The USS Eldridge was built in Newark, New Jersey, and launched in the summer of 1943. According to Navy records, the ship then remained in New York and Long Island Sound until September 16th, when she sailed to Bermuda to undergo sea trials. In mid-October, the Eldridge returned to New York in a convoy. 2 weeks later, she was called to the U.S. Navy base in Norfolk. From there, she sailed for Casablanca, arriving on November 22nd. By mid-December, the Eldridge was back in New York, where she remained for 2 weeks, taking part in a training exercise before heading to Norfolk once again. In the first week of January 1944, the Eldridge was sent out into the North Atlantic as one of the escort ships to a large merchant convoy. Then on to the Mediterranean, where she supported the Allied operations in North Africa. At no time, insisted the U.S. Navy, was the Eldridge anywhere near Philadelphia. If the Navy records are true, then what prompted Allende to write to Jessup claiming to have witnessed the apparent disappearance and teleportation of the Eldridge between Philadelphia and Norfolk? There is no doubt that Allende served as a deckhand aboard the Liberty ship Furuseth. But were his ship and the Eldridge ever in the same area at the same time? According to Navy records, the Eldridge left Newark for Brooklyn on August 17, 1943, and arrived there the next day. The Furuseth sailed from Norfolk on August 16th, traveling up the coast in a convoy before heading east towards North Africa. It is quite possible that she passed the Eldridge en route to Brooklyn as the destroyer emerged from Delaware Bay on the morning of August 17th. Did Allende really see something strange as the two ships drew near, and over the next few years become confused in his own mind over dates and locations? He was adamant he had watched the Eldritch materialize in Norfolk, then vanish again, turning up in Philadelphia a few moments later. But he apparently told no one at the time, and certainly from that day to this, no one has ever corroborated his incredible story. Later, Lieutenant William Dodge, master of the Führerseth, categorically denied that either he or any of his crew had seen anything unusual while in Norfolk. And William Van Allen, captain of the Eldridge, said that his ship had never been to Philadelphia. It was suggested that if Allende had seen what he thought was something strange happening to a ship in the Norfolk Naval Yard, it might have been nothing more sinister than a degaussing installation. This was an ingenious British innovation adopted by the U.S. Navy during World War II to protect ships from magnetic mines. It involved fitting a series of electric cables around the outside of the ship's hull, from bow to stern. By running a measured current through the cables, it was possible to cancel out the ship's magnetic field. The equipment could be turned on while the ship was at sea in a combat area. If it worked properly, the ship would then be magnetically invisible to mines, although still clearly visible to the naked eye and detectable by radar or underwater listening devices. The U.S. Navy later suggested that a misunderstanding of how degaussing functioned might well have given rise to the supposition that they were experimenting with total invisibility. But the story of the Philadelphia experiment refused to die down. The Navy's information officers became so exasperated at having to deal with constant inquiries, they resorted to putting out a standard statement, claiming the Navy had never conducted any experiments on invisibility, either in 1943 or at any other time. The Navy also produced the Eldridge's log and war diary from the relevant period. This clearly shows that the destroyer was nowhere near either Philadelphia or Norfolk during the period in question. Throughout the 1960s, journalists and other investigators made repeated attempts to track down the mysterious Carl Miguel Allende. But no one could find him. In fact, everyone wondered if he'd ever existed in the first place. It began to look as if whomever it was who'd contacted the late Dr. Jessup in 1956 with his rambling account of a disappearing warship had pulled off a gigantic hoax. But then in 1969, Allende, whose real name turned out to be Carl M. Allen, showed up at the offices of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. He claimed that after reading Jessup's book, he had been so frightened that he made up the story of the Philadelphia experiment. He wanted to throw Jessup off. Later, however, Allende denied making such a confession. He insisted once more that he really had seen the Eldridge disappear when he was a deckhand on the Führerseth. But by now, no one really believed him. Allende had left the Merchant Navy in 1952, taking various oil drilling jobs in Texas and New Mexico. When he was eventually tracked down by journalists and authors, he was adamant about what he had seen, although vague about the details. He died in Colorado in 1994. To this day, no one really knows whether his extraordinary claims were true or if he was just an attention seeker with an overactive imagination. As for the Eldridge, the destroyer which may or may not have been made to disappear, she finished her war service in the Pacific. In January 1951, she was sold to the Greek government, renamed the Leon, and scrapped a few years later. But the legend persisted. In 1984, the so-called Philadelphia experiment was even the subject of a full-length feature film with a sequel in 1991. In March 1999, 15 surviving members of the Eldridge's wartime crew held a reunion in Atlantic City, New Jersey. All were amused about the continuing rumors that they had been involved in some top-secret experiment. They even wondered why, out of all the U.S. Navy ships, theirs had been the one singled out as the subject of such a wild story, especially since, as they pointed out, the Eldridge had never docked in Philadelphia at any time during the war. There is no doubt that World War II was a period of accelerated research, during which many previously unthinkable concepts became reality. But whether or not such research included making a ship vanish remains one of the 20th century's most compelling mysteries.